New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we're going to explore the stories of people who believe themselves to have actually piloted a UFO. My guest is Grant Cameron, who's been a UFO researcher and experiencer for decades. His books include Jimmy Carter, Paranormal and UFO Tales, The Portals and UFOs of Mount Shasta, Triangles, Aliens, and Messages, the Canadian Government UFO Story, the Clinton UFO Storybook, Charlie Red Star, True Reports of one of North America's biggest UFO sightings, Breakthrough, the Psilocybin School, Weird, Paranormal Tales of Apports and Manifestations, and today we'll be focusing on his book, UFO Sky Pilots, Pilots of Peace and Oneness. Grant lives in Canada. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Grant. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Jeffrey, thank you for your invite, and it's always an honor to talk to you, to talk to somebody who's been in it as long as I have, back in the days when they invented Earth.
Well, I'm so impressed by your book on UFO Sky Pilots. I know it came out about 2.5, 3 years ago, before the most recent revelations. And in that book, you talked about how UFOs are like conscious beings in and of themselves. They are sentient, and that the people that you've interviewed and read about talk about communicating with the UFOs and piloting them through a form of telepathy. And you predict in that book that even though such a hypothesis seems to conventional minds totally absurd, you believe back then, a couple of years ago, that it would be validated and would become an accepted truth. And I think we're getting closer and closer to that point.
Yeah, it's quite a surprise. But it's like any of my other books that I've written. It was a sort of a synchronistic random event. And when I first heard it back in 2013, like I had the download experience in 2012, which talked about ESP, and this is all got to do with consciousness. And in 2013, they set me up with a woman who was in her 70s. And they said, "Are you still going to talk to Pam Dupuy?" This was in Phoenix, Arizona. And I said, "Well, I guess so." And I remember her coming into the house where I was staying, and she started talking about remote viewing for the government, and she was abducted, and she's a psychic and this, and you hear all that kind of stuff. But when she first mentioned to me that she was flying the craft, I was just horrified. Because I had been 39 years in the business since at that time, and I'd never heard about it before. I had no clue about this. I thought she was totally crazy. I was going to throw her out of the house. And I said to her, "They let you fly the craft?" And she said, yeah, they did. And I was thinking of Saudi Arabian women at that time. You couldn't drive a car without a man in the car. And I'm thinking, you're like in your 70s. I didn't say that to her, but you're in your 70s and, no license, no insurance. And so I didn't know what to say. So I said, "Well, how do you fly a craft?" And then she said, "Well, you do it with your mind." And that was what started the whole thing. And I went and I started to look on the internet at that time. There was really no stories about this type of phenomena with people claiming to have flown the craft. And then within a couple of years, I had 36 people that came to me. So this is not some event where one person told the story. This is 36 people. And since then, I've gotten all sorts of other people, like Whitley Strieber has confirmed that he had that same experience. And there's, I think the free survey shows of the people who answered the question, 14% say they've flown the craft. And I remember talking to Ray Hernandez, and I thought it was very, very interesting. But Ray here said, well, lots of stuff happens on board the craft. And I said, yeah, but Ray, when they start flying the craft, don't you think we should talk to them and try to figure out what's going on here? And I found out that I gathered all these stories, and I found out that it may be the most significant thing that I've ever discovered. And that is that it has all these spiritual crossovers into other phenomena. And as you pointed out, this idea that the people who are on board the craft are told to touch something. So you have this meme. It's like a dream, or like a vivid dream or something like that. And so, but all the dreams are different. And that's what surprised me. But it took me a few years to put it together, whereas people would be on the craft. They would end up on the craft. They don't know how they got on the craft. And there would be somebody behind them, which was one of the significant spiritual things that seemed to come across. At the end, I started to discover that people were claiming there was somebody standing behind them that was giving them instructions what to do. And Jim Semivan, the famous CIA guy who was the equivalent of a 2-star general, said it had this guardian type thing going on about it in behind him. And I immediately thought, is that a spirit guide? And so that was kind of the things where you start to see these crossovers. But the whole thing with the touching the craft, that they were all told to touch the craft. And or they'd be asked, where do you want to go? They would touch the craft, and they would all say the same thing. All 36 people said the same thing. The craft was alive, it's conscious, and as soon as I touched the craft, I became one with the craft, and whatever I thought is what the craft did, which is extremely significant, because basically what you're doing is you're looking at AI intelligence maybe 5,000 or 10,000 years from now, or definitely in the future. And you start to understand that this is what AI is going to look like. And it's different than the way we've sort of hypothesized it now, is we think it's going to be some sort of a computer type thing. And I don't know if you've ever interviewed Federico Fagin.
As a matter of fact, I just finished editing my newest interview with Federico. I love that man.
Yeah, and he talks about this thing about, he invents the microprocessor, and he talks about the computer chip, and he gets all the transistor, and he gets all excited, and he says, it doesn't know it's a computer chip. There's never going to be AI that's going to come out of a computer. It's a switch, off, on, off, on, off, on. And he's getting all excited. He said, it doesn't know it's part of a computer. It doesn't know what's going on. The human cell will know what the whole body. It's got the blueprint for the entire body. And potentially, if you go back and go back to the original cell, that original cell had the information for all the life on Earth. And it's this idea where it's going to be this biological thing. And that's what these people are talking about, that the craft was alive. It was biological. It was actually living. And then the other significant thing, there's a pile of significant things that came along, like people seeing in 360 degrees. And as soon as I saw that, I realized that's out-of-body experience. That's near-death experience. They report the same thing. So it's almost like they're in the same sort of field as these other people. And then when the people would touch the craft, they would get instructions from the beings. And I remember the one guy, he was a Mormon guy out of Utah, and they said to him, Ron, where would you like to go? And then he said, I'd like to see the Milky Way from a distance. And they said, okay, Ron, it is within you. Go within yourself. When you can imagine it, then we will go there. And then I had another person that came to the same thing. It's within you. Go within yourself. And this goes to this Sufi expression. You see yourself as a puny form when within you is enfolded the entire universe. And that opens up this whole aspect of what's actually going on here, almost like remote viewers. Do remote viewers actually fly to the target, or is the target inside themselves? The idea that everything may be within us, this field, and we're accessing something inside. So this was the thing, and people would say that they instantaneously move from one place in the universe to the other place instantaneously. And that goes to the near-death experience literature. And I don't know if you've had, her name is, she's from Colombia. Her name is escaping me now. Ingrid Honkala. She was a NASA biochemist working in the ocean and stuff like that. And she talks about her near-death experience, which is almost exactly the same as this instantaneous movement from one place to another. She had an experience when she was 3 years old, near-death experience. She fell in a pool of water in her backyard. And she said she was out of her body. And then she saw this dog and she says, oh, I love dogs. And boom, she was instantly with the dog. And then she saw this tree down at the end of the street. And she said, oh, look at the tree. And she was instantly at the tree. And then she thought about her mother. Oh, my mother. And she was instantly on top of her mother. And that's this whole idea that when you think about it, you instantly move to that place, which people with out-of-body experience will relate. And so that's what I discovered with these people flying the craft, is it had all these other stories that were going on in behind, that you said, oh, if you've done like a lot of parapsychology research and the different types of psychic experiences and stuff like that, you realize it's almost like the same thing. And you start to wonder, is this a dream? Because a lot of people would come to me and they'd say, I think this is a dream. I thought it was a dream. And I say, everybody thinks it's a dream. Just tell me the story. You were flying the craft. And this would be the thing where they would see even Chris Bledsoe, where Chris Bledsoe talked about when I was talking to him. And then he said, oh, I've flown the craft. I said, you've flown the craft too? And it's like almost everybody I was running into at that point was flying the craft. And that's when he brought up this other thing that Hal Puthoff and other people have talked about, where he said, I said, okay, don't just say anything. I'm going to phone you on Skype. I'm going to talk to you, and I want you to tell me exactly how to fly a craft. So then he got on, and he said he went up the craft. He went inside. It was 30 feet on the outside, and then it was on the inside. It was the size of a football stadium. And I said, well, other people talk about that as well. This whole idea that the craft is bigger on the inside than the outside. And the original woman that told me the story, this Pam Dupuis, told me that they have crafts that are as big as solar systems. And I thought, oh, you're totally crazy. Now it starts to make sense, where they can make it as big as they want on the inside of the craft, where you sort of assume that there's something wrong with time and space, our idea about time and space. So Chris said he was on the inside, and then he said that he was told to put his hand on a panel. So everybody touched something different. That was the key thing that was weird, is nobody touched the same thing. Like some people touch a panel, some people push a button, some people would. Chris Bledsoe had this panel, or this sort of a post in the middle of the room with this like a beehive, like a black plastic beehive thing on top of it. And he put his hand on it. And then when he took his hand off it, you could see sort of like a CD-ROM with the colors going through, and you could see where his hand was. And the inside of the ship started to shift, and these hexagons started to spin in the walls. And he said suddenly the window opened up, and he was over the top of the Cape Fear River where he had been abducted. And he said, I was sitting there on my cross-legged on the floor, looking out the window a couple inches above the water of the Cape Fear River, going, Yahoo! As he flew down this flying saucer. And it was just so bizarre, where you would get these things, and then you get other people that would back them up. Like the thing about people being behind you. This was repeatedly, people would say, there was somebody behind me. I wasn't allowed to look. I couldn't tell who it was. They were giving me instructions. And so I went to Whitley Strieber and I said, hey, Whitley, I got this weird thing. People keep reporting to me. I said, have you ever been on the craft lots of times? He said, yeah. I said, you ever have anybody behind you that's telling you what to do and you can't really look? He said, like all the time. I said, really? He said, yeah, I was going to steal a craft. I told you that. I was sitting in front of this panel board or whatever. And he said, I'd sure like to steal this thing. And he said somebody behind him telepathically started laughing. So it's a bizarre story that sort of got bigger and bigger and bigger. And it sort of led to all sorts of other things that were very spiritual in nature, which is, I think, where I've really changed now. Like Chris Bledsoe used to say, this is all going to be spiritual. And I think that that's the way it's going to end up being, that it's an ontological world, that we came from somewhere, we're going somewhere. And if you believe that this is more than a materialistic universe, we probably have always been here. We're always going to be here. And this is just sort of an example that backs this up, that I firmly believe now that this is going to be way more than complex than ETs. I'm actually writing a book called Extraterrestrials or Maybe Not, that when you start looking at the beings, you start to realize something's wrong. Like you'll ask, like I asked Betty Andreas, and she'd been experiencing beings since she was like 6 years old, and her husband, Bob Luca. And I'd say, hey, you're old grandparents now. You've seen this thing your whole life. Yeah. Hey, do you ever get any older? Nope. And then Bob Luca said, well, they live a long time. But that's one of the patterns. You start seeing these patterns. They never get any older. Or with Chris Bledsoe, when did you first meet them? They've been with me since before I was born. And then the regressionist said, like in your last lifetime? And he said, yeah. And you get that kind of stuff, and you start to realize the mystery that we're dealing with here is not really so much a nuts and bolts thing. I think this may be a very sort of spiritual thing, that they're pretending to be beings, that this is way more complex than we've ever thought. And I still am sort of honored that I got to play this game and be sort of at the leading edge of what I think is a revolution in terms of how we view the world.
You mentioned the fellow Ron from Utah who wanted to fly out so that he could see the whole Milky Way at a distance. I think the Milky Way is 120 million light years, 120,000 light years across, I believe. And so he traveled, I gather from your book, about 70,000 light years in a second or two. And if I remember correctly from your book, he described a feeling of almost pain from, if not almost, intense pain from the acceleration.
Yeah, he was one of the few that talked about an acceleration. And he almost like he said it was like a book. Like they were flipping through a book, going through dimensions. That was his interpretation of what was going on for 1 second. He said it very intense. And yet when I asked him, I said, and this is where it gets kind of weird. I said, well, Ron, why would they teach you to fly the craft? And he said, well, they told me that it would be flying people off the planet. And the thing is, he's always had this heart condition. He's only got, I think, 16% of his heart left. So I thinking to myself, well, he can't possibly be flying people off unless he's doing it when he doesn't really realize what's going on. And that was one of the things where I started to think, well, maybe this was a lesson for people to learn about time and space, that it may not be the actually moving from one place to another. Because when you get down to it, it's the whole idea of, is there time and space, like in a dream? And you say, well, there appears to be time and space in a dream, but is there? No, there isn't. And it's the whole idea that it all may be one point in space, and that it's like, how many universes can you fit on the head of a pin? We've got this sort of interpretation that there's all this space out there, and yet when you look at quantum physics, it's starting to back up what we're having. Like Donald Hoffman says, the time-space concept is doomed, and you're starting to get this movement away from our normal ideas. And that's the whole thing, is when you get these bizarre things that don't fit, they're outside the bell curve. That's when you start to look at these things. Like another thing Ron told me, and he's had 50 years of experience. I got him to write a book, and he wants to edit it and edit. I said, Ron, nobody's going to read it anyway. Might as well just put it out. And 50 years of experiences. And one of the experiences he had was the being that he was dealing with was by the name of Elby, which is one of the patterns I've found with these people. I even had a couple of days ago. I asked a woman, she said, oh, they come in threes. They come through the closet. I said, what was the name of the one you were dealing with, the main guy? And she said, oh, his name was Lord. And that's what you find. You have this pattern that only one alien deals with the person, and they have a name, and they relate to them. But Ron, this LB, took him to the spirit world 3 times. And I remember him telling this story. They went to the spirit world 3 times. And the first time it was sort of dark. He really didn't see anything. The second time he could hear his mother. He couldn't see her. And the third time he said it was as real as the real world. He was with his mother in this field, and he saw this temple. And it looked like a Mormon temple. He mentioned some town in Utah where it was. And he said, his mother said to him, you know, Ron, when you die, you're going to get a room in this building, and your father's already in here. And he could see the wall open up, and he could see his father inside this temple. And then he went, and he said, we went inside the building, and he said, the weirdest thing, Grant, was, he said, it was like 100 times the size inside as it was outside. And I'm thinking to myself, what, is he in a flying saucer, or is he in a temple in the spirit world? And that's when you see these crossovers. The other crossover he talked about is his mother took him down to the end of this room, and at the end of this room in this huge building, there was a table with these crystals coming out of the table, and so she said, when you die, you're going to get a crystal. And he saw the crystal as dog. And he said, you look at it at a 3-dimensional angle and you can see what happened. So he saw his dog's crystal, and in 1972, his dog disappeared. He never knew what happened to his dog. So he was watching this crystal, and he could see that the neighbor had shot the dog and threw it in the junkyard. And the thing with that is, you see the crossovers to other phenomena. You're very familiar with Michael Newton's Journey of Souls. 7,000 people regressed into the spirit world, and he tells the story. You're in the libraries, and you open these books, and inside the book there's a crystal, and you can see your past lives and your future lives. And then you go to the UFO thing with this documentary in 1988 where Richard Doty's talking about the most amazing thing he ever saw was the aliens had this crystal, and you could look at it at a three-dimensional angle, and they actually showed the American government the crucifixion of Jesus on this crystal. So this is the thing, that you see these bizarre things that no way this should they happen, that all people are describing these same things, and you start to wonder, what kind of world are they in? And to me, it comes down to it's like a vibrational thing, that the higher you vibrate, you go into these different levels, and there may be endless numbers of levels, and just extremely significant in terms of I think the development that we've made, because in 75, when I started, there was nothing. There was just UFO sightings. There was ground traces, which haven't happened for 30 years. They stopped doing that. And the odd abduction thing, like Travis Walton was taken the same year as I had my first experience. And the 75 was also the year that Linda Howe got dragged down the rabbit hole. Bud Hopkins got down the rabbit hole. That was the Billy Meyer thing, started in 1975. And in 1975 was the first near-death experience book that was written. So you start looking at this, but there was nothing in terms of what we got now. You got people doing light language and stuff that I never would have believed was going to happen. And it's almost like I call it the intelligence. Whatever the intelligence is, it seems to be unraveling these stories to us. And it changes as people will argue with me. Oh no, it's extraterrestrial. I say, well, if you think it's extraterrestrial, go back to 1897. Do you seriously believe that these wooden ships with balloons and sails on them flew through the vacuum of space from Mars? Do you really believe that? Oh no, they accustomed it to their time. Exactly. You see the phenomena keeps changing. It goes from that to the Foo Fighters, to the green fireballs, to the Adamski crafts, to crafts with windows. There's no crafts with windows anymore. And then the triangles, and now we've got the orbs. And it's almost like they're changing the phenomena as it goes along, as we develop and start to understand. And I think we're making great progress. People think we don't, but I say absolutely. The consciousness is rising, because when I first started, it's not like it is now. You can go to the deepest corner of Africa or China or whatever, and you can say Area 51. Yeah, I know what that is. UFO, I know what that is. Near-death experience, I know what that is. We don't realize that the consciousness is rising, and it's almost like Max Planck said, to paraphrase him, you don't convince your opponent, you don't sell your opponent by convincing him he's wrong. Science advances when your opponent dies. And the one funeral at a time, the new generation is not offended with the idea. And I think that's basically what we're looking at here, is that we are moving this consciousness up, or moving it down the road. And it's just a matter of time till it'll flip, when everybody's going to say, when did this happen? Oh, I don't know when it happened. But that's basically, I think, what's happening is all these phenomena, even Skinwalker Ranch, all this kind of stuff, it's in the zeitgeist now. And I think that's what the phenomenon is doing. I call it the theory of wow, or I call it the Jesus circus. That what they do is they do all these really weird things, like Jesus did, walk on water, feed 5,000 people, or raise Lazarus from the dead, because you do all the miracle stuff and you get everybody's attention, then you deliver the message. You don't go and deliver the message first, because that's left brain. You want to do this thing where you get everybody's attention, and I think that's exactly what they're doing. They're doing this thing where they're doing these weird things, and you and I are talking about it, and the more we talk about it, the more it goes up, and people are watching documentaries and they think they're not getting influenced. They are being influenced. I think we are on the edge of starting to understand how the world actually works in terms of reality, because I think that's what it comes down to. You and I came into the world to do something, and we believe we have a job to do. And in the end, it's going to be ontological, because we came from somewhere, almost like the Chris Bledsoe thing. It goes back into past lifetimes. Even John Mack had some cases like that, where the being was in the last lifetime. And I say, if the being's in your last lifetime, then you really got a problem with calling this thing an extraterrestrial. There's just, it gets more complex, and they're sort of unraveling this bit by bit to us, because the book that I got, there was no way this was random. It was just sort of like all these people, fell into my path as I started this idea that I first thought was totally stupid, and yet it is a very important idea that gives the idea of artificial intelligence. It gives you the idea of there's something wrong with our time and space, and the fact that, especially the one I consider, when they say it is within you, go within yourself. And I believe that may be the whole concept, that everything is within us. There's a field, and we are almost like receivers. And we are not Jeff and Grant. We are Jeff and Grant, who are playing puppets on a stage. And when it's all over, we exit stage right. We go, and then we go into another puppet. And this puppet dream, we don't even remember. So why get wound up about it? And I think that's what it is. We just go off and on stage to experience this, and we get help from these beings who everybody seems to say they're related. I know these people, I've known them, they're my family. You hear this over and over and over again. Like there's some sort of connection which wouldn't exist if there was extraterrestrials lost in space.
Well, we need to talk about what is now referred to as psionic assets. And this is something that has appeared primarily in the news just in the last 30 days, that our own government has been training young children to interact telepathically with these vehicles and control them from the ground, and even on some occasions cause them to land and to be captured. This has been all over the news lately.
Yeah, and there again, that moves the ball down the field in terms of people saying, this phenomena, and yet we had that before. Like we knew, for example, like children, like they meant reference children, and we know that children who have physical or sexual abuse often turn out to be psychics and mediums and stuff like that. That we know that children, until they're 7 years old, the left brain doesn't come online, and that's why they can remember past lives and stuff like that. So children is a thing. And then the other thing it sort of amazed me with this guy talking about was the fact that he was dealing with a female thing, which I had in one of my 27 psilocybin experiences that I did for a book. And I couldn't believe it when I actually believed, and I didn't see anybody, but I absolutely knew I was dealing with a woman. And so that really impressed me when I heard this whistleblower. The thing that sort of threw me off about it was they've changed the name from CE5 to psionics, and it makes it sound really scientific and really cool or whatever. But Stephen Gurr's been doing this. He had his first CE5 event in 1975 again. And I remember Chris Bledsoe. I remember asking Chris Bledsoe, and that Chris Bledsoe had all these people around him. And that's the whole point, is that if you want to make contact with the intelligence, you got to go. Forget about looking at lights in the sky and counting green ones and red ones and all that kind of stuff. You go to the people who are actually having the experiences. And that's what they did to Chris Bledsoe. And that's when he was giving them information. So I said to him at one point, I said, "Hey, Chris, did they actually, all these guys were at your place, all these military people and intelligence, did they ever ask you how to fly a craft?" He said, "Oh yeah, they brought me into a one-star general, and he wanted to know how to do it. And I described to a one-star general in the Air Force how to fly a craft." And so this is the whole deal, that this is, people like Bledsoe have been doing this all the time. Or the one story I've told in a few books is there's been a couple of events. And it would make sense that if you're in the military, you're going to try to make contact with these things. So in the 1950s, apparently the planes were flashing lights at them when they were scrambling to try to make contact. And then there's the famous story of 1959, which is in a documentary called UFOs Past, Present, and Future, where it was actually given by Art Lundahl, who worked at the CIA at the time. And this had to do with a Navy intelligence guy who was dealing with a woman in Elliott, Maine, who was channeling an alien. So they were talking to her, and then she said, "Why don't I just teach you how to do it?" And so the guy sat down, and she put her hand on his right shoulder, and suddenly he started to do automatic writing, and he's talking to this alien. So he goes back to the CIA in Washington, D.C., and he's a Navy intelligence guy, but he also works for the CIA, and he goes into the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C., which is where all the U-2 SR-71 and spy photographs are analyzed. And Art Lundahl, the guy in the CIA that was the expert on UFOs, ran that facility. And so he said, "Oh, you're talking to the alien? Okay, sit down, let's talk to the alien." And this is all on this documentary, and it was Robert Friend from Blue Book who actually did the description on the film, because Art Lundahl said, "I'm on duty, I can't do it." So they got Robert Friend to tell the story. So they got the guy, and he starts this automatic writing, and Art Lundahl, the CIA, is asking these questions. Do you favor a religion, this, and all these questions? And the guy's answering, and then he said, "We'd like some proof." And then the guy goes from automatic writing to talking. What do you want? We want you to show yourself. When? Now. Go to the window. And all these people, these CIA people, go to the window, and this UFO flies over top of the Capitol. And when Robert Friend was called into that to investigate this, the guy went in a trance a second time. They got this alpha alien, and he said, "No, the time isn't right." He went back to a general at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and he said, This is amazing. This guy's Adam's apple is moving down. Something's going on. We should investigate this." And he said, "Another agency has it. Hands off." And so 1959, they were trying to make contact with aliens. And then, of course, there's the very famous story that Hal Puthoff and other people will back up that this actually happened. That was the Holloman Air Force Base story, which my friend Bob Emenegger had. And that was the story at Holloman Air Force Base. This is a story that the president sees a 15-minute color film of this landing at Holloman Air Force Base, either in 64 or 70. There's a dispute as to what the date is. But that was the one I remember I asked, the three crafts come in. The one, it looks like it's in trouble. It lands. The other two fly away. And so I asked Bob Emenegger, I said, Bob, that's kind of weird. I said, if it weren't for the location, if it weren't for the time of day, that story sounds exactly like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He said, what, I didn't tell you? I said, no, you didn't tell me what? He said, I didn't tell you I gave a copy to Steven Spielberg in 1975. I said, no, you didn't tell me that. He said, I told you, Annie Spielberg, his sister, worked as a line producer for me. We gave it to Steven Spielberg, and he put it in, and it was in the movie in 1977. He just changed the location of the event to go to Wyoming. And then he said, and after it was all over, Steven Spielberg's mother came to him and she said, Bob, I've seen your version of the landing, and I've seen Steven's version, and I like Steven's version better. And this is this whole idea that if you want to figure what's going on, and I keep going after the UFO community all the time, is you've got to talk to the experiencers. They're the ones that are interacting with the intelligence. It doesn't help to even push government for disclosure, because I'm sure all they're going to say is the thing's for real, and we really don't know, because you get this whole thing about consciousness that this has been verified. This whole thing about flying the craft. Lakatsky, who ran the OSAP program for the DIA, this one that the New York Times mistakenly wrote up as ATIP in 2017, he said, we've discovered that the craft is a combination of psychic and physical material, the technology to fly it. And so he got it. And then there's the story of Bob Bigelow. And I don't know, I'm not sure it was on your interview with him or not, but he said a number of contractors had this material, but they couldn't really get anywhere with it. And I think it has to do with consciousness. Again, this idea that in order to turn the craft on, you have to have consciousness. You can have the craft intact, and you're not going to get it off the ground, which is why they're making no development, because it involves this consciousness interface. And then the other thing that happened with regards to that was that Tom DeLonge told this story that he was in a Lockheed skiff in 2015, and he was talking to Robert Weiss, who's the head of Lockheed, the head scientist, and this other guy who I now believe was this Ryder guy, this James Ryder. It was a vice president at Lockheed. And he said, the one guy asked him, he said, I just want to know how they get here. How did they get here? And then he was hanging around with Stephen Greer, so he said, I think consciousness is involved. The guy said, now you're talking. And he said, that's all the guy wanted to talk about for 45 minutes. And I'm pretty sure that was this Ryder guy, because the story, as you know, the rumor story going around was that Bigelow almost got a craft from Lockheed Skunk Works. And the story was that I'm pretty sure they'd gone to Ryder, because in the interview, the lectures that Ryder does, he talks about his good friend Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, and they went to get the craft, because both those guys were working, like Hal Puthoff was working as a contractor for the OSAP program, and they went to get this craft. And Ryder said, if you can get a thing from the Air Force, we don't want it anymore, because we're burning money. We've cost, as they point out, 10 times the money for the security as for the program, and they're burning money because they can't do anything with this craft, and they got to store this thing. And they went to the Air Force, and the Air Force said, not only can you not have the craft, but Lockheed has to continue to guard this craft for forever, if that's what it comes down to. And then the CIA stepped in to block it. But this is this whole idea that they couldn't get it to work. And I'm pretty sure that Ryder gave authorization for this craft to be moved to Bigelow at Bigelow Aerospace, but the whole thing was blocked by the Air Force. So, but again, you get these guys, and Jim Semivan has confirmed that there's consciousness involved, and there's just been one confirmation after another in terms of people like the Barber. Barber talks about the fact of flying the craft. Those whistleblowers, they're talking about flying the craft. And you see it over and over again, which basically means we're onto something, and that's the roadblock they've got. You can, almost like Jim Semivan said, people say, well, they've got bodies and crafts. Yes, they may have bodies and crafts, he says, but that doesn't mean you know what you're dealing with. And that's this whole idea that you can have the craft and you can't get the thing off the ground. You can have the bodies, but you don't know where they're from. Almost like a seance where a turtle appears, falls out of the ceiling, like Stanford, his brother, Thomas Stanford in Australia, that happened. A turtle falls onto the medium table. So what do you get there? Is that an extraterrestrial turtle? No, it's coming out of another field. If these beings understand how time and space works and how matter is put together, they know how it works, and they can make anything appear, anything manifest. And you see that over and over again. That one of the questions I always ask the experiencers is, hey, do you ever ask him if he's an extraterrestrial? I've never had anybody question to say that they're an extraterrestrial. I had the one in Great Britain where there's a channel, aliens wanted to talk to me. So the first question I said, hey, are you an extraterrestrial? And then the word comes back, would you like us to be an extraterrestrial? We could do that if you want. We could even take you to our planet. But no, we're not extraterrestrials. We've always been here. You're the visitor. And that's this idea that it's all here and now. It's all alive at the same time. And that's where I think you and I are on the leading edge of understanding the world is not the way we think it works. And that's why they're doing these weird paranormal things, is they're just trying to get across to you, no, the world is not physical the way you think it is. Because what they're trying to do is create awe and curiosity. And until there's awe and curiosity, there's no investigation.
I'd like to talk more about Pam Dupuy, the lady who got you started on all of this. I found that her descriptions were the most elaborate of any in your book, and I think our viewers would benefit from hearing a little more about her story.
She was in a hospice the second time we interviewed her. She was dying when we interviewed her, and she talked about how they went from stage to stage, and it's almost like it was set up, because you'd think that there's thousands of years advanced they'd actually know, but they said they put a band around her head, and then it was a smaller band, and then she didn't have to have the band. And she told us a lot of interesting stories that parallel what other people talk about, where she was trained as a young child, and you'll see this all the time. And it's like, why do beings, whoever they are, the entities, why do they take young children? They take young children, almost like the idea there's in the Bible. You take them, you train children before they get old, and then they'll know the way. I can't remember the biblical expression is, but that's what they would do. And she would tell the story that somebody told, identical story, that they would sit in a row, all these kids, and she couldn't see the beings. She could only see from here down, and the beings were teaching them to levitate these balls. And there was 3 different colored balls. One was very easy to levitate, one was not so easy, and then one was very hard to levitate. And they would train these kids as they were being brought up. And you see that over and over again. And that's this whole idea of this psionic thing of using children, that the beings are training these children as well. So she got into this thing where she told me, when I said, "You've flown the craft? Come on." And then she said, "Yeah, I've flown 3 different models." And she would talk about these 3 different models of the craft she'd flown and where she'd flown. But it was so unbelievable at the time, like especially the thing about they've got ones as big as the solar system. So it's almost conceivable that they could have something as big as the solar system. People say, well, you'd be able to see that, but you got to remember that they can make it appear as big as they want. So it could actually be a rock sitting on the side of the road. And if you break the rock open, there's a civilization in there the size of a solar system. And that's this whole weird thing about time and space. Even like Susie Hansen, the top person in New Zealand, has written 2 books on the experiences with the Greys and what they taught her. And she talked about the thing where they said to her, okay, watch this. We're going to make the craft bigger. And she said they went, and the walls started to move. The white walls started to move, and they moved and they moved and moved. And she said, and it got so big, she couldn't see the walls anymore. It was that far away. And there's a guy who's an experiencer, runs MUFON Japan, who learned to do out-of-body experience. And he learned it through the Monroe Institute, and he could do it at will. And so he would go and he'd say, what do I want to do? I want to go to the gray ship. So he'd be on the gray ship, and he would tell me these stories. He'd be on the gray ship, and the gray would just go to the wall, put his hand by the wall, and a book would come out of the wall. And these bizarre things, almost like they can manifest whatever and they just understand more about how the whole thing works. We have this ego that gets us in this world that we think we know what's going on. And as they told me numerous times when I was doing the psychedelic things, you think you know what's going on. You haven't got a clue in this big ego thing. And I remember the one time I got really upset. They kept going about your ego is so big and you think you know everything and stuff. And so I said, well, I didn't come here. I just came here to learn. I didn't come here to do it. And so you tell me what the heck's going on. And this voice says, we don't know either. And I go, oh, come on, you don't know. So it's like this idea that they just know. And we think, even going back to the Big Bang, what happens in science is, as I point out to people, in science, what they do is they name things. So it's like the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be named is not the Tao. The eternal name is not the name is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. So what I'm saying is that it's all a verb. The craft is alive. We're alive. Cells are alive. Everything's alive. And what science does is it changes it from a verb to a noun. It's inanimate. It's not conscious. It's not alive, and it's contained, and it's random. And our thing is it's all a verb, and that's what they do. So they change things to nouns, and it's just a bunch of nouns bumping into each other, and it's all random and stuff like that. When in fact, if it's a verb, it's all one thing. It's all connected to one, which is the main message. The Ray Hernandez from the 4,200 experiencers, the main message they got, 54% of people, they were talked to about oneness and love, which is the key. Oneness is the key message, and love is the basis of the universe. And that's where you start to look. But most people still are ignoring the experiencer. They're trying to prove to their friends and relatives that this is really for real. And when I ran up against the telepathy tapes, I tried to warn them, don't go down the road that UFO people went down. Because it's like, we're going to prove that these kids are telepathic. We're going to prove this. And it's like, you could spend the next 80 years. Do you think Shermer, that Shermer is going to shut down the Skeptic magazine? They'll always have an answer. It just goes. And we've done that for 80 years. We've tried to prove it. And then somebody comes up with a new answer. And then you spend all your time trying to prove it. And we're doing this, and it's like the definition of insanity. You're doing the same thing over and over again and assuming that you're going to come to a different answer. We're still trying to count things instead of talking to the experiencers to understand that these people are telepathic. They have all these talents and stuff like that, and that there may be this field, and it's the ability to shut the left brain down, get in the field, get the material, and bring it back into the world. And these kids, when you see these kids who are telepathic, yes, it's going to be important. If you can prove in Faraday cages and stuff that these kids are 100, not like you had one of the remote viewers on, he said 5 to 10% really high end results in remote viewing. These kids are 100%. They don't miss. The same as you get these calendar counters, these autistic calendar counters. So you can say, name the next 12 years when April the 1st will fall on Easter. Or Easter will fall, and they'll name the next 12 years when April the 1st will fall on Easter. And yet they can't button their shirt, they can't do anything. And that's the whole thing. There's this field, and he's getting it out of a field. He's not counting. They ask him, what's 2 times 3? He says 5. He's not counting. He's not mad at multiplying. And that's the thing, is we've got to realize that these people have so much potential. These kids, not only are they 100% telepathic, they all speak foreign languages. Diane Hennessy Powell had the one kid, 5 years old, he spoke 8 languages, and one was Russian, one was Arabic, one was Japanese. They were like these weird languages. And you look at that and you go like, why would you not spend time, forget about it. It's real, just assume it's real, and let's go on to the next thing. And what can we learn from these kids about why are they speaking other languages? And I even asked Kai Dickens a couple of weeks ago, I said, have you got any who had aliens? Because you start to see these crossovers, like Eben Alexander, Near-Death Experience, had aliens. It was pulled by the publisher. No, we can't put this in the book. So they left the alien thing out. So I said to her, hey, any of these kids dealing with aliens? She said, just one. When I get the details, I'll give you the details on that. But you start asking these kids, like they're talking to dead people. And you go like, these kids are like a gold mine. So forget about trying to prove it. Let's get past that and find out what potential, how can they add to how the world, or this thing about the hill, this idea that these kids are on this hill, this telepathic, they're from all around the country, and they never leave the house because they can't take care of themselves. And yet they're all telepathically on this hill, talking about this hill, and they're talking to each other. It's just like a gold mine of material. And I just can't believe that so much material has come out in the last couple of years that gets us to understand not so much a mystery of UFOs or telepathy, but the nature of reality, to understand that we're starting to understand how reality may actually work. And it's not the way we were taught in school. And that's probably why there's such a fight for it. That I always say that when it comes to disclosure, it's not the Christian people, the religious people, they're going to be jumping off the bridges. It's going to be the scientists who spent $50,000 a year to go to MIT who are going to be fighting for the cyanide pills, because it's like everything. You mean that all that stuff is wrong? They just can't. It's like a skeptic is just somebody who has a very firm worldview. They can't move off that worldview. And if you move outside, it's totally pointless. And I've done it for years. You've probably done it as well. It's wasted so much time trying to convince somebody that you're right. And it just doesn't go anywhere. They'll just come up with a different answer. And it's just, to me, it's just a total waste of time. But you and I are in the Super Bowl. We're on the field, and we get to actually watch this thing unfold. The most amazing story that will ever happen in humanity.
it's pretty clear to me from the opening section of your book, Grant, that you're taking I guess I'd have to call it a radical position, sort of like Bishop Berkeley, that consciousness it's not only primary, it's everything.
Yeah. Yeah. My view of the world now is and I was raised very religious. I was supposed to be a minister. But the way I look at it now is God did not create anything. We're all part of God. We're fields of God, not sparks. Because when you take sparks, that makes it a noun. It's like we're part of the field of this verb and God just lets us loose. And we're the ones that are creating the heaven and earth. You hear that? You see that in Michael Newton, where he's talking to them. He said, "What are you doing?" The guy said, "I'm making a rock." You see, "You're making a rock? What do you mean you're making a rock?" He said, "Well, I can't do plants yet." And it's this whole idea that we're creating the universe, and the universe gets grander and grander and more complex, and we add stuff, and you add this and you add that, and that's what it is. And then God looks back on himself through our experiences. And that's what you start to get is it's not the world that we've been taught. And so to me, it's like we may even create the afterlife. We may create there may actually be heaven. There may actually be reincarnation. Because I remember hearing people who are doing mediumship, and they were talking about, what are you doing? "Oh, we're raising our family, and our kids are with us." And I'm going, how is that possible? How can you be, in the spirit world, raising your kids? Well, what about your kids? How do they fit into this thing? What are you? They're your pets or something? It's this weird idea that you may actually create the afterlife. That we made this thing about the afterlife, how you go from spirit, to the spirit world and then back again, and reincarnation, all this stuff. Now we've developed all that. We sort of think that God creates the heaven and earth and then puts consciousness into it, and it's consciousness that creates the heaven and the earth, and it's completely backwards. But that's I think where you and I are ahead, and it's going to develop because of developments that have happened. And I think we're being given this stuff. I don't think this is random. Mine wasn't random. And the whole thing with the kids, you look at these kids and they'll complain, these autistic kids, oh, this because of, different, shots they got and stuff like that. Well, however it occurred, you and I know this idea that we came in to do this, that we came in for a reason. And maybe you need that shot for the kid to be autistic because the kids are coming. Because when you talk to the autistic kids, they say, we don't want to be helped. We don't want to be cured. We're good just the way we are. We're here to help you. I asked Diane Nancy Powell, did they actually say that? She said, yeah, they actually said that. The kid said, we're here to help you. And that's this whole thing. Everybody's got their purpose. And you say, well, I'd rather be not paralyzed or handicapped or whatever. But everybody's got their role. And these kids are playing in very, very important role. And I just regret it because when I was at the university, I was a manager of a bunch of buildings, and they would send all the grade 12 students to me who were autistic and had these problems. I didn't know at the time. If I had known that these kids who couldn't speak could have been, I would have asked questions, but I just sort of treated them like, we've got to try to help them and do their, cleaning and whatever they're doing and stuff like that. I missed that, but I got a second chance at it. So, if anybody has not heard the telepathy tapes, it is revolutionary. Totally switched everything around, and it's what we've looked for. So it's not, as I said, it's not something where it's, statistically significant. It's 100% accurate. Same as these kids, these people that are autistic, and they ask them, on this day, what day of the week was it? It's Tuesday. What was the weather like? Oh, it rained in the morning and then it cleared up at noon. And they remember who was on TV and what the tie the guy was wearing on the game show, and just like unbelievable. And that's where you got to look at these kids. And then you get the awe and the grandeur of God. You start to understand how magnificent the world actually is, because we're missing half of what's actually going on. The power and the potential of the human mind is unbelievable. And these kids are pointing this out. But unfortunately, we get caught into trying to prove it. We're going to try to prove it to people that this is real and we're not crazy. We're not Rodney Dangerfield. We don't get any respect, and we're going to get this. And we could waste years and years and years instead of just getting past the fact, yes, this is all for real. And what can we learn from this?
Earlier, Grant, you mentioned that I think what you said was that all of the experiencers, the pilots that you spoke with, said it was a dreamlike experience. And yet we hear reports of the government with people who are wide awake and dealing with apparent physical craft that have been lured down and landed and captured, and they've got even children they're trying to train to pilot these things. I've heard reports that they get dizzy because of the time travel aspects of it. But some accounts still seem to describe it as very physical, and when other people say it's dreamlike, I don't know. Does that mean it's definitely not physical? How do you interpret that?
There is the two different aspects where people say it is real as real can be, and the other people who I remember there was a colonel, U.S. Air Force retired colonel out of Los Angeles, when he didn't come to my lecture, but I talked about flying the craft in a lecture, and then he came to the sort of dinner after that, at the restaurant, and they said, David, you got Dr. Grant. He was talking about flying the craft. Tell him your story. And then he said to me, I might have been a dream. I think it might have been a dream. And I said, everything's that. And I remember there was one guy, he was a United pilot, 747 United captain. And he had it. And then he was talking to Joe Burks, and he told Joe Burks, it's this weird dream about flying the craft. It was just weird. And then a year later, he had it. He said, Joe, I had that dream again. And Joe says, I think it's time for you to tell the story. And then he actually went on audio with me and told me this story. So it does have this different aspect, but you see this all the time with the abduction experience. So some people talk about this dreamlike thing, and then you start to wonder, because you see this whole thing where nobody ever sees anybody being abducted. It's always this sort of individual type thing. And, you start wondering what's going on. And then you start looking at the aliens, where they don't get any older, and they don't have any muscles and tendons. So how do they move their legs? They have these little stick legs, and they don't breathe. When Hopkins had, David Jacobs had them, they would do this thing where they look right into the person's eyes. And then Jacobs would say, is he breathing? And they'd say, no, he's not breathing. And you start looking at it very carefully, and you start to realize this makes no sense. Some of the stuff where they don't have any clothes on. I say to people, hey, did the guy have any clothes on? No, I don't think he had any clothes on. Never thought about that. I said, don't you think that's kind of weird? Yeah, it is kind of weird. And then I say, do you have any sex organs? And they say, no, I didn't have any sex organs. Well, if it's a biological being, how can it have sex organs? And then people always say, well, on their planet they don't, and stuff like that. But I got a list of like 25 things that just don't make any sense whatsoever. If you start looking at the physiology of this thing, or the being, where Mike Clellan tells the story. A lot of people will tell this story about the beings can take on whatever form they want. The one actually said, Sherry Wild, and I don't know if you've interviewed her, she wrote a book called The Forgotten Promise, which was the idea where she had promised to do this, and she was fighting her whole life. She actually tried to commit suicide a couple times. She was trying to get out of it. She just couldn't stand it. And they told her, you're going to write this book. So I'm not writing your damn book. And it's, no, you got to write this book. It's important. And she finally wrote the book, and her daughter tried to stop her from publishing the book because they were a real estate agent in a small town in Wisconsin. You're going to ruin everything for all of us. And then she went to the publisher, and the being whose name was Da, like they've all got a name, which makes me think maybe this is a spirit guy. Maybe it's not even an alien. And Da was the name. And so Da said he was from Andromeda. So the publisher said, he's from Andromeda? She said, yeah, he's from Andromeda. But you said he's a gray. Yeah, he's a gray. He's a Zeta. Well, then he's from Zeta Reticuli. He can't be from Andromeda. What's he telling you? Well, I'm going to ask him. So next time he comes, okay, so what's the deal here? He says, are you an alien, or what's going on? He said, no, that would not best describe who I am. I'm actually an etheric being on a mission in the cosmos for the universe. And that's when you start to realize, like, this is the spiritual thing. This starts going to the spiritual thing. And Mike Clellan tells the story where the owl guy, he tells the story where he's camping off the road in the main interstate in Utah, and he's sleeping in a sleeping bag in the middle of the desert. And he wakes up and he sees this, looks like a UFO sitting on top of the hill. He goes, that's a UFO. And then he goes back to sleep again. And all of a sudden he's out of his body, and he's floating above his body, and he goes above the ship, and he's above the ship. And all of a sudden, boom, he's into the ship. And there's these two grays on either side of him. And he's walking down the hall, and he said, there's a gray suit hanging on this hook. And he doesn't remember how it happened, but he walked past the thing, and he said, suddenly he says, I'm a gray. And I'm looking at myself like, what's going on here? And he looks at the beings, and he's 6 foot tall, and these beings, he's the same size as these little 3 foot beings. And he's looking at his hands. He's going, this is just weird. Like, how is this going on? And then he goes in front of the council, which you see all the time, where they can't see the faces. These beings are all sitting at this table. And he said it looked like a hotel room in Indiana, like a cheap hotel room in Indiana, like carpet and a wooden table and stuff like this. And he says, this is weird. And then he's going, what am I doing here? What's going on? And they said, it's time. He said, it's time for what? It's time. It's time. It's time for you to get going. What do you mean it's time? And then suddenly, I guess they put it in his head. He goes, they said, you volunteered for this. I did. You never told me it's going to be this like this. You never told me it was going to be this bad. You never told me it was going to be this depressing. You never told me this. And they said, you volunteered for this. You volunteered for this. It's time to get going. And 2 days later, he starts the first owl book. And you start seeing these experiences out of body, and you start wondering, like, if you go through walls and windows, are you actually physical? Or are you, Betty Andreasen told that story, where they take her to see the one, which is the idea is God behind the glass doors. And they're bringing her back, and she says, she gets into the backyard and she's at her trailer. She says, oh, it was so wonderful to be home. And I went running into the trailer, and Bob was sitting there sleeping. And then I walked into my bedroom, and I was sitting on the side of the bed. So I got into my body and got into the bed and went to sleep. And that's when you start seeing these things, that you get these crossovers all the time, that orbs happen, not just UFOs. They happen in UFOs. They happen in mediumship. They happen in psychics. They happen all over the place. And we're trying to, almost like the Ray Hernandez experience, when they pull him up and he sees all these images going around, remote viewing and psychic phenomena and stuff, and the wheel is spinning in the middle of his consciousness. And they said, you got to quit parsing this stuff. It's all the same thing. And that's where you start to learn these lessons. And when you listen to these experiencers, they'll say these weird things, like they were inside a temple in the spirit world, and it was 100 times the size inside, which is exactly what even Danny Sheehan talked about that. And I think this is one of the reasons they shut him down, was Danny Sheehan told a story about a recovered craft on the ground. The guy went in, and it was huge on the inside, and he became all disoriented on the ground. And after that, suddenly Danny Sheehan wasn't talking anymore. And he said that because he said he'd never signed a non-disclosure agreement, but they got him on the attorney-client privilege. So they've got him, he's their attorney. So they said, Danny, if you want to keep playing the game, you can't be talking about this stuff. Now, Danny, the one interview I heard, I can't talk about that. I can't talk about that. I can't talk about that. And they basically, because now he's under this thing that he's representing the government people, and he's not allowed to talk. But he did tell before, he told this story about being inside the craft. And even Hal Puthoff says, yes, this is real, that these crafts are bigger on the inside. And that just says the world is not the way you think it is. And if you think it, you're missing the point. That's where we get to be on the very leading edge. Or Gary Nolan says that. He talked about this fact. He says, I'm not interested in the 95% that fall inside the bell curve. I'm interested in the 5% that fall outside the bell curve. That's where the Nobel Prizes are.
Well, Danny Sheehan told that story on New Thinking Aloud about 6 months ago, as a matter of fact. Because it's out there, I asked him a direct question, so he acknowledged that it was true, and I'm glad that you understand that it's also a true story. Grant, this has been a joy to be with you, and I know you are giving me the tiniest little share of your vast encyclopedic knowledge of these things, so I hope to have you back many times on New Thinking Aloud.
I appreciate your interest, and thank you for having me on.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for being with me. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org